Hey guys, it's Dasha. Welcome back to my channel, and welcome to today's video, which is a wrap up and review of everything I read in the month of April. I had a solid reading month. I definitely did not do great in terms of like TBR and finishing things that I started, but I got through quite a few things that I really wanted to read, some bigger books, continued some series, all sorts of good stuff. So we're gonna go in my usual order from my least favorite to my favorite, and we've got a little bit of everything in here. We've got from 2 stars to 5 stars, or 2.5 stars to 5 stars. Like, there's a lot of interesting things happening, every genre from horror to nonfiction to fantasy. Since we have a lot of things to talk about, let's get right on into the first book I want to talk about, which is, actually that's a good question. What do I want to talk about first? I think we're gonna start with Nothing But Blackened Teeth by Cassandra Khaw. So the reason I even read this was because for my TBR game, I had to pick a book from someone's worst of whatever year list. And this was on a lot of people's list for last year. It is a horror novella about a group of friends that are going to a wedding, and this wedding is in Japan at this like old abandoned house that has a really weird history, and these friends are all like paranormal hunters, so they think it's going to be super fun, and then of course shit hits the fan. I gave this 3 stars when I read it, but the more I think about it, I don't think I like it that much. I don't know if I'm gonna lower my rating, because there are things that I really liked about it. I actually did not mind the characters as much as everyone hated them. That was a very common complaint I've seen about this book. And while their gripes with one another were super petty and childish, and I really disliked the dynamic between them all, I actually really liked our main character and being in her head. And I didn't mind some of the other characters. It was just really their relationships that were super whack that I didn't like. I also thought the plot was like kind of anticlimactic. Unlike a lot of people, I actually quite liked the writing. I didn't think it was overwritten, overly flowery. I thought it was quite nice. I really enjoyed it. So I didn't hate it from that perspective. The pacing was like super weird for such a short book. There is just so much build up. And then it kind of fizzles out, like, you know when you let go of a balloon and it kind of what it felt like you filled up, there was like all this anticipation, then it kind of fizzled, and then there was like a climax out of nowhere. Like, it wasn't a great book, but the atmosphere was good. Like I said, I liked the main character. Like, I didn't hate it. I didn't love it. It will leave absolutely no impression on me. It's an incredibly mediocre book, but it's not like hateable. I didn't think it was terrible. So this one's just getting, yeah, that's why I think I settled on 3 stars, because it's the most like middle of the road thing. Even though I gave the next book I'm gonna talk about 2.5 stars, I think I like Nothing But Blackened Teeth definitively less overall. It's entirely unremarkable and unmemorable, and like it wasn't like a massive waste of my time. It was just extremely meh. I have much stronger feelings about the next book I'm going to talk about, and that's Ring by Koji Suzuki. So this is a translated work of Japanese horror. This is what the famous movies are based on, when people watch this videotape and then they get a call saying, now that you've watched the tape, you will die in 7 days unless you do this. And so you're following a reporter whose niece dies, and she dies in some kind of very mysterious way, so he's like starting to look into it, and then he gets sucked in. Wow, I have such strong feelings about this book. Holy shit, let me tell you. The beginning was insane. Right off the bat, you get the perspective of the niece, the girl that dies, as well as someone else that dies that is connected, and it was spooky. And it was horrific, and you were on the edge of your seat. Everything was tense. It was so good. And then the reporter's part kicks in, and that was the most dull fucking thing I have ever read. The reporter is extremely unlikable. He is sexist and extremely dull and very stupid. And while I understand like sexist characters because sexist men exist, it was just really jarring to read from. Just the things he would say about his wife just took me out of the story, because I'm like, why? And I feel like this might be a thing in a lot of Japanese fiction, because I have also read the translated work Battle Royale, which had these really like dry matter-of-fact statements about people that were really jarring. So I'm wondering if it's just the way that maybe Japanese fiction is, or maybe we're just not used to it from our perspective. But it's just a very jarring writing style, talking about people in this way. So that was unlikable for the main character. So you're following, like, you're going through his eyes, and he's so miserable. Like, I hated him. So that was a strike against it. The majority of this book is an investigation into this, but it's definitely more of like a police like sitting and searching through archives. There's absolutely no atmosphere. There's absolutely no horror happening through most of it. And there's absolutely no suspense, I feel like. Even though the reporter has 7 days, there's no suspense. Like, you're not like wondering if he's gonna make it, which is kind of disappointing. But then the other thing is that he has this friend, this man who he considers his best friend, who confided to him in high school that he raped a girl, and that since he raped 2 other women, and they're best buds. And the reporter, the main character, almost idolizes him because his friend lives in a carefree way for other reasons than the sexual assault. But it's like, it's just so jarring. Like, I think it was supposed to maybe add, I don't know. I really don't know. It's just so weird. I don't know why that was in the book. I assume there was a reason for characterization, or maybe for the maybe to not make you feel bad when the friend watches the tape, because you're like, okay, well, at least a rapist is gonna die, not like a family man with wife and daughter. But it's just kind of weird. I don't know. That whole thing just really threw me off the whole time I was reading this. Every time his friend appeared on page, he was just really gross. And he was like supposed to be teaching all these life lessons about like living out loud to the main character. And I was like, this is not, something's really off about it. I don't know. So that was that. And you know, like I said, it added to the fact that there was no horror or atmosphere, and it was just dull reporting. And then the end comes, and I love the end. I thought it was great. The atmosphere came back, the feeling of dread, all these like, what would you do situations that the characters are put through. And I'm like, holy shit, okay, this is great. What the fuck happened to the whole middle of the book? What happened to the middle of the book? I have such strong feelings about this, because if I was going solely off the beginning of ending, this would be a 5-star read. But everything in the middle was such flaming hot garbage that I feel so angry about this. I can't decide if I hate it. I can't decide if I love it for the good parts of it. It's just a confusing mess to me, and I just had such higher hopes for this. Maybe the movies are spectacular. I'm just so let down. But I love the concepts and the really cool situations at the end that are actually horrific. And the atmosphere at the beginning. The atmosphere was so palpable and horrific, and I just don't know how we got to this whole middle reporting boring ass part. So yeah, I'd settled on 2.5 stars for this because I have so many thoughts. Like, I really do not know where to sit on this. There are such good things about it, and there are such shit things about this. So it is what it is. Would I recommend this? Maybe if you go into it knowing that it's almost more reporting, journalist, like mystery based rather than horror, you might enjoy it more. I thought there was going to be a lot more horror in this, so maybe I was just disappointed. So maybe be aware that it's a little bit different. That might help with your enjoyment. For me, this was just a little bit of a fail, but also like amazing in certain parts. Like, this is just such a, I don't know what to think still. And I finished it weeks ago. Okay, that hot mess aside, let's get into the next book I want to talk about, which is The Cold Vanish. And I forgot who this is by. You're gonna have to give me a second. Okay, so the full title of this book is The Cold Vanish: Seeking the Missing in North America's Wildlands, and it's by John Billman. This is a nonfiction book about people who vanish in national parks in the US mainly. There are a couple mentions of Canada, but like North America, it's mainly the States. As usual. So it's basically just following a few of these stories, a few family members of people who have gone missing, and talking to them and how they feel, as well as introducing some really interesting statistics in terms of, you know, chances of success, chances of survival, the actual way that we don't know how many people are missing at any given time in the forests, the way that there's like jurisdiction issues. This was really interesting from the perspective of someone like me who does not know anything about missing persons cases in national parks. My true crime knowledge is pretty limited to famous like serial killers and a few cults. So I actually don't know much about like missing persons cases specifically. And I think what makes this so interesting, and I hate to use the word refreshing because I know that these are real people and it's not meant to be entertaining or entertainment, I guess. But it is a really interesting like puzzle, and the author actually talks about how it's hard for us to deal with missing people in our minds, to conceptualize them, because we always think that there must be a rational explanation, or we try to look for rationale in their last moments and their actions and the things that we find from them, and try to piece together a puzzle. But sometimes either the most simplest explanation is true, which is that they, you know, the person fell off into a ravine somewhere and died. But sometimes the more sinister is true. So they brought up a few cases where it was foul play. There was there was someone who was known to abduct and kill a woman from a certain area in this like national park. So sometimes that way is true too. But at the end of the day, there's no blanket way to search for and find these people. There's all these jurisdiction issues because national forests and national parks in the United States are dealt with by two different ministries, so they barely coordinate. It's a very frustrating read. I feel like if you are someone who gets frustrated by bureaucracy and law enforcement, this book will be a very, like, you'll be angry, but you'll feel like righteous anger at how frustrating it must be for the families to go through this. Overall, I enjoyed the book. I ended up giving this 3.5 stars. I thought that the author's tone was just a little weird because he became very close with the father of a young man who went missing. And that was kind of the overarching story through other stories and concepts that he presented. So he was like following the father, who was this really positive man that was just trying to find his son, literally dropped everything and started like roving around the country trying to find anything that would help. He listened to psychics, he listened to like sightings in small towns where he think his son might have went. And I just found like the author toting along with him and talking about him was just a little weird. I can't put my finger on it. It was just very, very casual. Some of the things he said was just a little too casual for how serious the topic is. But I also did enjoy that the author made sure to mention that obviously cases where pretty young white women go missing get a lot more attention versus all the missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada and the United States. I actually really appreciated that he made a point to mention that, because I feel like that's a gross oversight on a lot of people's parts when you talk about missing people and missing women specifically. It's a lot easier to whip up an entire nation into a frenzy over a pretty white woman than the thousands and thousands of women on reserves that go missing because they're just not seen as trendy as pretty white women that have a social media presence that people suddenly care about. So I really appreciated that he brought that into the book, because I feel like that is a big part of the conversation. I ultimately found that there was a lot of things that I learned from it. I just found that the format for me did not work. Like I said, there was the overarching story of the one man searching for his son, and you bounced back and forth between him and other stories, and I found that it got a little disjointed at times. I didn't really love that. And I also felt that like the author was really repetitive sometimes. I think he mentioned like 4 separate times that the department, the national forests are run by Department of Agriculture, and then the national parks are run by the Ministry of Internal Affairs. Like, we get it. You told us once, you do not have to baby me. I read your book. Like little things like that just drove me nuts. But I feel like if you've never read about these kind of cases, this might really, really interest you. I felt like overall it was a mostly respectful approach in terms of the actual discussion of victims and missing people. It wasn't dealt with in it didn't feel like a spectacle like I find some books can make out of victims, and I felt like the author genuinely cared. He seemed to care, I don't want to say like too much, but like he's an outdoorsy person himself, so he went on like multiple searches for people if they were around the area where he lived, because he always lived close to like some wilderness. And like, I feel like it's all coming from a good place. Just your mileage may vary, maybe depending on how sensitive you get around discussion of victims of crime or something like a disappearance. But like I said, overall I learned a fair amount from this. It was pretty interesting. I like the kind of personal touch. The writing is super accessible. I feel like it just wasn't a great fit for me because I feel like all of my complaints are kind of nitpicky and super personal. But since the writing is so casual, the author's like voice really comes through. You might really enjoy this because it is definitely a super approachable book, and it's a fairly quick read, and it is super interesting, especially if you are also fascinated with the idea of like missing persons in forests and what happens to them and how the searches happen and how they decide what to focus on and how they look at the clues left behind. I think that was kind of an interesting exploration of that. It just wasn't like my favorite book ever, but it's definitely an interesting subject matter. So I would still recommend it. It's pretty short and it's worth your time, I think. The next book I want to talk about is a little disappointing, not gonna lie, and that is The Bone Shard Emperor by Andrea Stewart. I actually finished this in the month of May, but like I read most of it in the month of April, so I will throw it into this wrap up. This is the second book in the Drowning Empire series. The first one was The Bone Shard Daughter. That one got a little bit of hype when it was released, but that one got some pretty mixed reviews. Now, I loved the first one. The first time I read it, it was a favorite book of the year. Since then, I reread it back in February? Question mark? It might have been March. And I thought it was good. I still really loved it. It just wasn't as good as the first time I read it. And unfortunately, this one ended up getting a 3-star from me. The magic just completely wore off for me in this. So this is a world where you have an empire that is made up of a lot of islands. So the emperor is already struggling to keep a hold on all these islands who all have a bit of their own culture and food and policies and all this kind of stuff. And in order to help protect the empire, he takes a bone shard from all the citizens when they are young, which is just a piece of bone taken from the back of the head behind the ear. And he is able to use the bone shards to inscribe upon and then put them into constructs, which are people or animals that are created to basically run the empire for the emperor. They're soldiers or they're spies or they are bureaucratic officials. And they're powered by the commands written on the bone shards. And in the first book, you're dealing with the perspective of several people. First, the emperor's daughter, who's trying to learn the bone shard magic and gain the approval of her father to become his heir. And you're also following Jovis, who is a smuggler in the empire. He smuggles children away from the festival where they take the bone shards, because when the bone shards are used, they actually drain your life. So a lot of people want to get their kids away from that, so they never have the opportunity to have their life drained from them. And you're also following a few other people. There's the sapphic romance with the governor of one of the islands and this woman who's lost her memory. Like, there's some really interesting things in the first one, and in the events of this one, you're following a lot of fallout from the first, and I just felt like all of the heart and soul went out of this, because you get a much different conflict with the emperor's daughter, Lynn. The conflict in the first book was with her father mainly and gaining his approval, and there's a much different conflict at her core in this book, and I felt like it just took all of the heart away from her character. It really depersonalized her, and I didn't like her. I didn't love her in the first book, but I felt like she was still compelling. I really didn't like her in this book. Jovis and Mephi are still fantastic. Mephi is Jovis's animal companion. Chef's kiss, I would die for them both. They're still great. I felt like the introduction of another antagonist in here was just really poorly done. I felt like the pacing was really off in this. I didn't love it. Like I said, the magic just went out of it. There was a romance shoehorned in between two characters that absolutely did not need it. Their friendship would have been incredible if it had stayed a friendship, and I felt like that was a much better choice. But then they started, heading in the romance direction. I was just really disappointed. I felt like a friendship would have been so much better for both their character arcs. One lost his wife like 8 years ago and is just lonely, and the other person is a very deeply lonely person, and I feel like they do not need to have a relationship to not be lonely together. I don't know. That was weird. You guys know I don't like romance in general, but it was just so poorly done, I think, in this. Maybe not poorly done, it was just unnecessary. I feel for the characters. I also felt like, I mentioned the pacing, and that was one of the things that threw me off the most. You'd get these like chapters where nothing happens, and then in this next chapter you get like 3 major events, one after the other, so characters don't have time to process what just happened. And I understand that real life is often a lot like that, but it just felt very oddly plotted. It felt like nothing really had room to breathe when it easily could have. And beyond that, I felt like the logic of a lot of these events was just really fucking bad. There is a battle between one of our protagonists, or several, and an antagonist. And at the end of this battle, the protagonists just start healing and moving on as normal without thinking, hey, I wonder where the antagonist disappeared to. I haven't seen them after the battle. maybe we should try to figure out where they are. No, they don't go look on the battlefield for them to take them as a prisoner of war, maybe. Like, just like the logic in this, and a lot of the battle logic was kind of iffy, and maybe that's like not Andrea Stewart's strong suit, because like her characters in her world are really cool, but it was just so blatantly illogical what was happening that it was very hard for me to take these people serious, which is why I feel bad saying this, but like I kind of don't. I feel like this definitely has YA crossover appeal because the characters often act like teenagers, which is nothing wrong with that. I just feel like when you're in the positions of power, like some of these characters, you shouldn't be acting that way, perhaps. So I feel like if you're looking for like crossover appeal and you don't mind characters who maybe don't always make the best decisions, but that do have a bit of heart and soul to them, this series might be great for you. I'm just really disappointed because I felt like everything made so much more sense in the first book, and this was ultimately a letdown. I still love the writing. I still love the world. I think it's so interesting, and I think Jovis and Mephi are some of the greatest characters. I enjoyed some of the more emotional conflicts that were put onto these side characters. Like, I didn't hate it, but I was ultimately just so disappointed for having loved the first book so much. I will finish the series. The third book is being released later this year. I will definitely read it. I just really had much higher hopes for this. But I don't want to put you off from reading this series because I do think it's underrated in terms of the very interesting world and magic system and the best use of an animal companion I've ever seen. The next 3 books were all like 4, 4.5, and 5 stars. So I think I'm gonna go ahead with Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas by Hunter S. Thompson. This is a classic work of fiction slash nonfiction. It was initially published as a work of fiction, but it has since, you know, because it was so controversial, but it has since come out that this is actually Hunter Thompson's actual lived experience. He created what is known as gonzo journalism, which is when a journalist inserts themselves into the story in a way that is almost like literary. I'm thinking of doing a whole video about this book because there's so much to unpack, like a lot of classics. And I think it would be beneficial for some people to like have a video before you go into it, just to discuss it a little bit. Because there's a lot. It basically follows Thompson and his lawyer on this like drug-fueled excursion into Las Vegas that involves a lot of lying, a lot of drugs, a lot of drinking, yeah, just a lot of very odd things. And I don't know what it was about this book, but I loved it. The whole time they're basically just fucked out of their minds on drugs, and yet somehow I was here for it. Did anything really happen? No. Did they find the American dream as they said they would? Not really, but sort of. There was like some interesting critiques on police and police culture. There was some interesting critiques on the American dream. They definitely talked about it a little bit. There was like some interesting cultural stuff injected, which once again I might talk about more if I do end up making that video, which I'm currently scripting and researching. But like there was some interesting cultural, social things happening, but like the majority of this book is just them fucked up on drugs and alcohol, and I kind of loved it. This is a very fucked up book. If you go into this, like a shit ton of trigger warnings for literally almost anything you can imagine. There's even like statutory rape happening that was like really kind of weird to read about. I've also heard some people say that if you've never done acid, you might not understand this book. And how do I say this? It definitely helps if you have. I'm just saying it might make a bit more sense to you if you have, but I think you can enjoy it if you're a responsible adult who has not done LSD. So there's that. This is just a weird trip of a book. Like I said, I can't even fully explain why I liked it because there's not much that happened, but it was just such a fun ride. The writing was so excellent, which is I think what kept me so hooked, even though what was happening was just a clusterfuck. Would I recommend this? Possibly, if you think it's for you. If you're looking at this or listening to this and thinking that sounds fucking horrible, then don't read it. Like, it's not a book I'd recommend for everyone, but holy shit was it a fun time. I ended up giving it 4.5 out of 5 stars. Definitely a new favorite classic for me. The next book I want to talk about is Blood of Elves. This is the first official reading order book for the Witcher series. However, it is the 3rd book in the reading order because there are 2 short stories before this, and the Witcher series is about Geralt, presumably, who is a monster hunter, with like unique abilities. However, and I mentioned this in my TBR for May, it's not about Geralt really. Geralt's like supposed to be the main character, but everyone around him is just insane. Incredible. I guess for plot, because literally like there's basically like no plot described for this ever, because everyone just kind of knows The Witcher from the games or from the show. Ciri and Geralt are brought together by circumstances. Geralt saves Ciri's parents when he is younger, and as a debt he says, I'm gonna come back in 7 years and take your child, because witchers are a dying breed, because they are specifically trained and mutated to become these excellent monster hunters, and they're dying out. People don't trust them. There's a bit less monsters in the world than there used to be, but there still needs to be someone to continue the art of The Witcher. So he says, I'm coming back for your kid. I will take them and train your child, and they will have a loving home as best as I can, and they will become a witcher. So he comes back, he gets Ciri, but Ciri is an incredibly powerful little girl. There's a lot of things about her, namely her very special magical blood that make other people just die to get their hands on her. So there's a ton of people after her. Geralt is already developing a very strong like father-daughter bond with her. Everyone in Geralt's life is falling in love with Ciri. And so you see all these little political machinations starting. You see people trying to hurt Geralt or Ciri or people around them. There's just so much happening. Was this book a setup book? Absolutely. There's like a whole chapter where it's just a bunch of rulers in this world getting together and talking about what they're going to do about the war, about this person or that person, and what they're going to do about Ciri. And for a lot of people, it could be super boring. 100%, I will acknowledge that. If you do not like political fantasy, this might bore the absolute shit out of you. Because while these short stories were very action focused and character focused, and this is super character focused, but it is also very politically focused, and I loved it. Personally, I thought it was fantastic. I'm obsessed with the characters in here. I'm obsessed with the politics in here. The found family dynamic in this is the best I've ever read, straight up. It is my favorite. There's just so much love I have for the way character dynamics are written in this series, and the world is just very real. Every area has its own culture, and you feel like it's real places. Obviously they are inspired by real life. We were talking in the live show actually about this, and I was trying to figure out what it's inspired by, because the author is Polish, and there's definitely some, like a nation in here that feels distinctly German, and another one that feels kind of Slavic. There's a couple of them. There's one that's definitely French, but like I don't really know what they are, but they're definitely still unique enough to not feel too derivative. There's just, I love it. I love it. I love it. Is it a little bit slow? Maybe. Is it still incredible? I love it. Yes. I can't speak anymore. Is it a little slow? Yes. Are there parts I cared about less? Yes. Are there still some absolutely heartbreaking and beautiful moments between the characters? Oh, fuck yes, there are. I love this. I love this series, and I'm so excited to continue. Our live show for this, I don't know if when I'm posting this video, but the live show for this is supposed to be May 6th, sometime midday if you're Eastern time. So if you are seeing this before the show, please come join us. If you're seeing this after, of course, I will have the link posted in my community tab and on my Twitter if you want to go back and watch it, if you are reading along with us, or if you have read it and you just want to hear more like in-depth thoughts. I'm just basically going to be gushing about it the whole time because I love this, and I'm so excited to continue the series. This is definitely a new favorite series of all time. Speaking of favorite series and favorite authors, 5-star read for me for the month is Mad Ship by Robin Hobb. Holy shit, what is there to say? This is the second book in the Live Ship Trader series. This is about families living in this very difficult area, and they have these live ships that are able to traverse this like very corrosive river. And these live ships are not only incredibly durable, but they become alive when 3 generations of a family die on board. And there's pirates, and there's sea serpents, and there's like magic tree houses, and there is magic cities with walls that light up, and there's politics, and there is drama, and there is romance, and there is like everything all at once, and I love it. Robin Hobb is officially my favorite author. I've been saying this for a couple books now, but the more I read from her, the more I just love her. I think she's just absolutely incredible. There's nothing she can't do. At first, when I read the first book in this series, I liked it, but I liked it a bit less than the Farseer series. And I think that is still the case for me, but I've just grown into this series so much. Like, I can't, my feelings when I read this series are unbelievable. I can't believe that books can invoke such a feeling in me. That's how good they are. The characters and how complex they are just never fail to astound me. There is a character throughout the whole first book that I just wanted to throttle. I wanted to fucking yeet her off a cliff. I hated her so much, and I really struggled to see how she would turn around. And then slowly throughout this book, it didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen over the course of like one day or one event. You slowly start to see her change, and it's so spectacularly done. She had so much room to breathe and still make bad decisions that I didn't like while also transforming as a person. And it's so good. Robin Hobb can make me feel things for literal boats, because the ships in here, the live ships, are alive, and I'm like feeling all the things for them. Like, Paragon is the most incredible character, and like there's so much. And then the family and character dynamics and how everyone's like breathing and having like room to grow into their own, and you just want the best for them. And you just like, you feel so attached to these people. And then like all the other stuff happening, like everyone on their own is doing their own thing, and you get all these perspectives and you see all these pieces slowly move into place, and you see how one action can have an effect on all the other characters, and you're just sitting there like, holy shit, shit's about to hit the fan. It's absolutely insane. It's so fucking good. I'm just absolutely enamored with the series. We were talking about it in the live show, and most people agreed that in theory, if you want to read Robin Hobb, you should start with the Farseer trilogy. And while I agree that it helps with some context and theories, I still feel like if you are intimidated or you don't like the idea of the Farseer trilogy, which just focuses on one character and you're in his head the whole time, I feel like you could still start with this series. I just want everyone to read Robin Hobb. She's the most incredible writer I have ever come across. Her writing is so like masterful. I can't believe that someone can just sit down and write things and it creates a whole universe. I'm in awe. I will always bow down to Robin Hobb. If you've never read her, I implore you in every video, I think, where I talk about her books, to please read her. And this was an easy 5 out of 5 star for me. It just built on everything from the first book so well. And I don't know where the series ending is gonna go, but I am terrified. That was it for the books I'd finished. I actually started a couple of books. I mean, I'm still in the process of reading The Shock Doctrine, which I started back in February. Apologies, because I did mention I thought I was gonna finish it in March. I did not. It's just a very dense book, but I am making my way through it. So whenever I do finish it, I will give a full review because I really want to talk about this. I'll also mention it in depth in a different video I'm thinking of doing, but I'm still enjoying this. I did mention in my TBR for May that I did start the Odyssey. This translation is fantastic. I would recommend to anyone who is thinking of reading the Odyssey but is terrified. This translation's so simple. It took me no time to read, but I feel like it's still enjoyable. So that's happening. And then I started Say Nothing by Patrick Radden Keefe. This is about the Troubles in North Ireland. I don't want to sit here and like yell about it too much. I'm just really enjoying it. I'm almost done. I know it doesn't seem like it, but like this is how much I have left to go, I think. So it's not too much. I feel like I'm getting there. Less than 200 pages to go. I'm really enjoying this. This is a really detailed account, very personal and painful, and it's something that we don't hear a lot about here in North America. So I would recommend this if you're thinking of reading it, but I will give a full review whenever I do finish it. Just keep your eye out for this in the pipeline. So that was it for April. I did mention I read a lot of things, but having to sit down and talk about them, a lot more than I expected. Let me know if you read any of these. I'm very curious to hear people's thoughts, especially on Ring, because I feel like most people that I follow on like Goodreads and Storygraph enjoyed it, so I'm a little nervous. Maybe I missed something, who knows? My social media is linked down below, as well as some other videos you can go check out. You can talk to me anytime on the social media or in the comments. Other than that, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!